Section 12 of Tales of Unrest. First part of The Return. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Ray. Tales of Unrest by Joseph Conrad. The Return. The inner circle train from the city rushed impetuously out of a black hole and pulled up with a discordant, grinding racket in the smirched twilight of a West End station. A line of doors flew open and a lot of men stepped out headlong. They had high hats, healthy pale faces, dark overcoats and shiny boots. They held in their gloved hands thin umbrellas and hastily folded evening papers that resembled stiff, dirty rags of greenish, pinkish or whitish colour. Alvan Hervey stepped out with the rest, a smouldering cigar between his teeth. A disregarded little woman in rusty black, with both arms full of parcels, ran along in distress, bolted suddenly into a third-class compartment, and the train went on. The slamming of carriage doors burst out sharp and spiteful like a fusillade. An icy draught mingled with acrid fumes swept the whole length of the platform, and made a tottering old man, wrapped up to his ears in a woolen comforter, stop short in the moving throng to cough violently over a stick. No one spared him a glance. Alvan Hervey passed through the ticket gate. Between the bare walls of a sordid staircase, men clambered rapidly. Their backs appeared alike, almost as if they had been wearing a uniform. Their indifferent faces were varied, but somehow suggested kinship, like the faces of a band of brothers who through prudence, dignity, disgust, or foresight would resolutely ignore each other. And their eyes, quick or slow, their eyes gazing up the dusty steps, their eyes brown, black, grey, blue, had all the same stare, concentrated and empty, satisfied and unthinking. Outside the big doorway of the street they scattered in all directions, walking away fast from one another with a hurried air of men fleeting from something compromising, from familiarity or confidences, from something suspected and concealed, like truth or pestilence. Alvan Hervey hesitated, standing alone in the doorway for a moment, then decided to walk home. He strode firmly. A misty rain settled like silvery dust on clothes, on moustaches, wetted the faces, varnished the flagstones, darkened the walls, dripped from umbrellas. And he moved on in the rain with careless serenity, with the tranquil ease of someone successful and disdainful, very sure of himself, a man with lots of money and friends. He was tall, well set up, good-looking and healthy, and his clear, pale face had under its commonplace refinement that slight tinge of overbearing brutality which is given by the possession of only partly difficult accomplishments, by excelling in games or in the art of making money, by the easy mastery over animals and over needy men. He was going home much earlier than usual, straight from the city and without calling at his club. He considered himself well-connected, well-educated and intelligent. Who doesn't? But his connections, education and intelligence were strictly on a par with those of the men with whom he did business or amused himself. He had married 5 years ago. At the time, all his acquaintances had said he was very much in love. And he had said so himself frankly, because it is very well understood that every man falls in love once in his life, unless his wife dies, when it may be quite praiseworthy to fall in love again. The girl was healthy, tall, fair, and in his opinion was well-connected, well-educated and intelligent. She was also intensely bored with her home where, as if packed in a tight box, her individuality, of which she was very conscious, had no play. She strode like a grenadier, was strong and upright like an obelisk, had a beautiful face, a candid brow, pure eyes, and not a thought of her own in her head. He surrendered quickly to all those charms, and she appeared to him so unquestionably of the right sort that he did not hesitate for a moment to declare himself in love. Under the cover of that sacred and poetical fiction he desired her masterfully, for various reasons, but principally for the satisfaction of having his own way. He was very dull and solemn about it, for no earthly reason unless to conceal his feelings, which is an eminently proper thing to do. Nobody, however, would have been shocked had he neglected that duty, for the feeling he experienced really was a longing stronger and a little more complex, no doubt, but no more reprehensible in its nature than a hungry man's appetite for his dinner. After their marriage they busied themselves, with marked success, in enlarging the circle of their acquaintance. 30 people knew them by sight. 20 more, with smiling demonstrations, tolerated their occasional presence within hospitable thresholds. At least 50 others became aware of their existence. They moved in their enlarged world amongst perfectly delightful men and women who feared emotion, enthusiasm, or failure more than fire, war, or mortal disease, who tolerated only the commonest formulas of commonest thoughts, and recognized only profitable facts. It was an extremely charming sphere, the abode of all the virtues, where nothing is realized, and where all joys and sorrows are cautiously toned down into pleasures and annoyances. In that serene region, then, where noble sentiments are cultivated in sufficient profusion to conceal the pitiless materialism of thoughts and aspirations, Alvan Hervey and his wife spent 5 years of prudent bliss, unclouded by any doubt as to the moral propriety of their existence. She, to give her individuality fair play, took up all manner of philanthropic work, and became a member of various rescuing and reforming societies, patronized or presided over by ladies of title. He took an active interest in politics, and having met quite by chance a literary man, who nevertheless was related to an earl, he was induced to finance a moribund society paper. It was a semi-political and wholly scandalous publication, redeemed by excessive dullness, and as it was utterly faithless, as it contained no new thought, as it never by any chance had a flash of wit, satire, or indignation in its pages, he judged it respectable enough at first sight. Afterwards, when it paid, he promptly perceived that upon the whole it was a virtuous undertaking. It paved the way of his ambition, and he enjoyed also the special kind of importance he derived from this connection with what he imagined to be literature. This connection still further enlarged their world. Men who wrote or drew prettily for the public came at times to their house, and his editor came very often. He thought him rather an ass because he had such big front teeth. The proper thing is to have small, even teeth, and wore his hair a trifle longer than most men do. However, some dukes wear their hair long, and the fellow indubitably knew his business. The worst was that his gravity, though perfectly portentous, could not be trusted. He sat, elegant and bulky, in the drawing-room, the head of his stick hovering in front of his big teeth, and talked for hours with a thick-lipped smile. He said nothing that could be considered objectionable, and not quite the thing. Talked in an unusual manner, not obviously irritatingly. His forehead was too lofty, unusually so, and under it there was a straight nose, lost between the hairless cheeks, that in a smooth curve ran into a chin shaped like the end of a snowshoe. And in this face, that resembled the face of a fat and fiendishly knowing baby, there glittered a pair of clever, peering, unbelieving black eyes. He wrote verses too, rather an ass, but the band of men who trailed at the skirts of his monumental frock-coat seemed to perceive wonderful things in what he said. Alvan Hervey put it down to affectation. Those artist chaps, upon the whole, were so affected. Still all this was highly proper, very useful to him, and his wife seemed to like it, as if she also had derived some distinct and secret advantage from this intellectual connection. She received her mixed and decorous guests with a kind of tall, ponderous grace, peculiarly her own, and which awakened in the mind of intimidated strangers incongruous and improper reminiscences of an elephant, a giraffe, a gazelle, of a Gothic tower, of an overgrown angel. Her Thursdays were becoming famous in their world, and their world grew steadily, annexing street after street. It included also somebody's gardens, a crescent, a couple of squares. Thus Alvan Hervey and his wife for 5 prosperous years lived by the side of one another. In time they came to know each other sufficiently well for all the practical purposes of such an existence, but they were no more capable of real intimacy than two animals feeding at the same manger, under the same roof, in a luxurious stable. His longing was appeased and became a habit, and she had her desire, the desire to get away from under the paternal roof, to assert her individuality, to move in her own set, so much smarter than the parental one, to have a home of her own, and her own share of the world's respect, envy, and applause. They understood each other warily, tacitly, like a pair of cautious conspirators in a profitable plot, because they were both unable to look at a fact, a sentiment, a principle, or a belief otherwise than in the light of their own dignity, of their own glorification, of their own advantage. They skimmed over the surface of life hand in hand, in a pure and frosty atmosphere, like two skilful skaters cutting figures on thick ice for the admiration of the beholders, and disdainfully ignoring the hidden stream, the stream restless and dark, the stream of life profound and unfrozen. Alan Hervey turned twice to the left, once to the right, walked along two sides of a square, in the middle of which groups of tame-looking trees stood in respectable captivity behind iron railings, and rang at his door. A parlour-maid opened, a fad of his wife's, this to have only women servants. That girl, while she took his hat and overcoat, said something which made him look at his watch. It was 5 o'clock, and his wife not at home. There was nothing unusual in that. He said, "No, no tea," and went upstairs. He ascended without footfalls. Brass rods glimmered all up the red carpet. On the first-floor landing a marble woman, decently covered from neck to instep with stone draperies, advanced a row of lifeless toes to the edge of the pedestal, and thrust out blindly a rigid white arm holding a cluster of lights. He had artistic tastes, at home. Heavy curtains caught back half-concealed dark corners. On the rich stamped paper of the walls hung sketches, water-colours, engravings. His tastes were distinctly artistic. Old church towers peeped above green masses of foliage. The hills were purple, the sands yellow, the seas sunny, the skies blue. A young lady sprawled with dreamy eyes in a moored boat, in company of a lunch-basket, a champagne bottle, and an enamoured man in a blazer. Bare-legged boys flirted sweetly with ragged maidens, slept on stone steps, gambled with dogs. A pathetically lean girl flattened against a blank wall, turned up expiring eyes and tended a flower for sale, while nearby the large photographs of some famous and mutilated bas-reliefs seemed to represent a massacre turned into stone. He looked, of course, at nothing, ascended another flight of stairs, and went straight into the dressing-room. A bronze dragon nailed by the tail to a bracket writhed away from the wall in calm convolutions, and held, between the conventional fury of its jaws, a crude gas flame that resembled a butterfly. The room was empty, of course, but as he stepped in, it became filled all at once with a stir of many people, because the strips of glass on the doors of wardrobes and his wife's large pier-glass reflected him from head to foot, and multiplied his image into a crowd of gentlemanly and slavish imitators who were dressed exactly like himself, had the same restrained and rare gestures, who moved when he moved, stood still with him in an obsequious immobility, and had just such appearances of life and feeling as he thought it dignified and safe for any man to manifest. And like real people who are slaves of common thoughts that are not even their own, they affected a shadowy independence by the superficial variety of their movements. They moved together with him, but they either advanced to meet him or walked away from him. They appeared, disappeared. They seemed to dodge behind walnut furniture, to be seen again, far within the polished panes, stepping about distinct and unreal in the convincing illusion of a room. And like the men he respected, they could be trusted to do nothing individual, original, or startling, nothing unforeseen and nothing improper. He moved for a time aimlessly in that good company, humming a popular but refined tune, and thinking vaguely of a business letter from abroad, which had to be answered on the morrow with cautious prevarication. Then, as he walked towards the wardrobe, he saw appearing at his back, in the high mirror, a corner of his wife's dressing-table, and amongst the glitter of silver-mounted objects on it, the square white patch of an envelope. It was such an unusual thing to be seen there that he spun around almost before he realized his surprise, and all the sham men about him pivoted on their heels, all appeared surprised, and all moved rapidly towards envelopes on dressing-tables. He recognized his wife's handwriting, and saw that the envelope was addressed to himself. He muttered, "How very odd," and felt annoyed. Apart from an odd action being essentially an indecent thing in itself, the fact of his wife indulging in it made it doubly offensive. That she would write to him at all when she knew he would be home for dinner was perfectly ridiculous, but that she would leave it like this, in evidence for chance discovery, struck him as so outrageous that, thinking of it, he experienced suddenly a staggering sense of insecurity, and absurd and bizarre flash of a notion that the house had moved a little under his feet. He tore the envelope open, glanced at the letter, and sat down in a chair near by. He held the paper before his eyes and looked at half a dozen lines scrawled on the page, while he was stunned by a noise meaningless and violent like the clash of gongs or the beating of drums, a great aimless uproar that, in a manner, prevented him from hearing himself think, and made his mind an absolute blank. This absurd and distracting tumult seemed to ooze out of the written words, to issue from between his fingers that trembled, holding the paper. And suddenly he dropped the letter as though it had been something hot, or venomous, or filthy, and rushing to the window with the unreflecting precipitation of a man anxious to raise an alarm of fire or murder, he threw it up and put his head out. A chill gust of wind, wandering through the damp and sooty obscurity over the waste of roofs and chimney-pots, touched his face with a clammy flick. He saw an illimitable darkness, in which stood a black jumble of walls, and between them the many rows of gas-lights stretched far away in long lines like strung-up beads of fire. A sinister loom as of a hidden conflagration lit up faintly from below the mist, falling upon a billowy and motionless sea of tiles and bricks. At the rattle of the opened window the world seemed to leap out of the night and confront him, while floating up to his ears there came a sound vast and faint, the deep mutter of something immense and alive. It penetrated him with a feeling of dismay, and he gasped silently. From the cab stand in the square came distinct hoarse voices and a jeering laugh which sounded ominously harsh and cruel. It sounded threatening. He drew his head in, as if before an aimed blow, and flung the window down quickly. He made a few steps, stumbled against a chair, and with a great effort pulled himself together to lay hold of a certain thought that was whizzing about loose in his head. He got it at last, after more exertion than he expected. He was flushed, and puffed a little, as though he had been catching it with his hands, but his mental hold on it was weak, so weak that he judged it necessary to repeat it out loud, to hear it spoken firmly, in order to ensure a perfect measure of possession. But he was unwilling to hear his own voice, to hear any sound whatever, owing to a vague belief shaping itself slowly within him that solitude and silence are the greatest felicities of mankind. The next moment it dawned upon him that they are perfectly unattainable, that faces must be seen, words spoken, thoughts heard. All the words, all the thoughts. He said very distinctly, and looking at the carpet, "She's gone." End of first part of The Return. Recording by Ray.